passed the Children, Young Persons, and Their Families Act, which instituted a practice called family group conferences as the default option for youth who are charged with committing a crime. Though the phrase restorative justice is not found in the Act, this legislation is often cited as the first inclusion of restorative justice into national law in the world. In particular, the needs of Maori and other Polynesian youth and communities, the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Islands, were the inspiration for this legislation. Responding to the long, ongoing experience of colonization and its devastating effects on indigenous populations, including the forced separation of Maori families, family group conferences seek simultaneously to respond to criminal activity by youth in restorative ways, while also empowering Maori communities to draw on and continue their own community-held cultural practices of justice, peace, responsibility, and healing. Over half of the youth who are charged with a crime in New Zealand are Maori. Like in many colonized lands in the world, the indigenous peoples of the country are among the poorest, most marginalized physically and culturally, and most discriminated against in this society. And because of this, they are often also the most policed. This pattern has been true in New Zealand, as it has been elsewhere, and has sustained racialized oppression imposed upon Maori for generations. The reality of Maori criminalization, paired with other colonial projects of land capture, native schools designed to assimilate indigenous youth into Western society, adoption practices that denied many Maori access to their families and their familial and tribal histories, and legal discrimination has created the broader social and political context in which family group conferences emerged. Criminal legal professionals, including Maori who worked within the dominant legal system, noticed that a large percentage of the Maori youth who were facing criminal charges were often also the youth who were most disconnected from their indigenous communities, languages, histories, and traditional practices. And it was in response to all these intersecting phenomena that the Family Group Conference, or the FGC, was born. FGCs are community-based decision-making processes by which communities, familial and/or tribal, come together to decide how to respond to harms done in the community and to reintegrate those who've harmed others. Like victim offender conferences, FGCs are often initiated by a formal referral from the legal system, and early in the process involve some level of one-on-one consultations with those harmed and those who've caused the harm to determine their willingness to participate in the process and to ensure that they understand how the process works. Unlike in victim offender conferences, where individuals often meet with a facilitator only, in FGCs, the primary face-to-face meeting between those who caused harm and those who experienced harm occurs in a public communal setting. That meeting often takes place in a marae, a traditional Maori village meeting place, filled with art and architecture representing Maori culture. The meeting will begin with a prayer, blessing, or song, often in the family's first language. And the logistics of the process are then described for those present, and everyone attending will introduce themselves. And then information sharing and storytelling occurs, both the statement of the facts of the case as described by the police and first-person testimonies by those directly impacted and implicated in the case. When youth are involved, either as one who's experienced or as one who has caused harm, a youth advocate is there as well to provide support and sometimes speak for a young person. And those youth who've experienced harms share their stories first, always, and the impacts that the crime has had on them. And then those who caused the harm are invited to share why they acted in such a way as to cause these harms and to accept responsibility for their actions. Those harmed then have an opportunity to ask questions of the persons who caused them harm to learn more about the whys, hows, and whats of their experience. And when well facilitated, these moments are often among the most healing and reparative parts of the experience for those involved. Up until this portion of the process, FGCs may sound familiar to the healing circles or victim offender conferences we've already discussed in previous lectures, or as some blend of the two. And there is overlap across these practices, both in the values that undergird them and in the practical aspects of the practices themselves. However, FGCs also include a unique component that emerges directly out of the historical and cultural contexts of the Maori people. After the initial public storytelling portion, the next step in an FGC is for those gathered to break from the marae to a new space for family deliberations or a family caucus. In their separate family deliberations, those who've caused and those who've experienced harm have time and space devoted to conversations with their family, which is defined broadly to include biological, tribal, and chosen relations. They discuss what's occurred, what's needed to move forward toward repair and healing, and how the family may be able to support them to live up to the agreements that will be determined through the FGC. The family becomes, in a way, a responsible party, and not only the individual offender or survivor. Often in the family caucus, the families must address their own internal needs and conflicts before being able to come to an agreement about how to support their youth, whether that youth is a survivor or a person who's caused harm to another. For example, the family of a person who caused another person harm may need to discuss why they were unable to prevent a family member from acting in such a way, the ways the harmful actions have impacted the offender's own family in kind of indirect impacts, or the implications of this experience for the family in the future. In addition, one family caucus can invite others from the other family caucuses in to fill in gaps in a narrative or to answer questions that folks still have. For example, a survivor's family may want to ask questions of an offender's family member to learn more about the context of the young person who's caused their loved one harm. When families have come to some shared understanding, they then draft a plan of action or an agreement that will be presented to the entire group. All involved, victims, offenders, their families, the broader community, legal system representatives, then hear the proposed plans from directly impacted families and then work to come to a shared agreement about the way forward. Once this is done, it's often the young persons who've caused harm that gives the final presentation of a final plan for approval and agreement. And their act of presenting the plan demonstrates that they're taking accountability, exercising agency, and publicly committing to the work of repair. Such plans typically include commitments from state representatives, usually about dropping charges if the rest of the plan is fulfilled or something like that. These plans also include a description of the modes of repair the offender will take in response to the expressed needs of the victims, a plan to prevent similar actions that would cause more harm in the future, a commitment to serve the broader community in some way, and a monitoring plan for adults and elders in the young person's family, again, broadly defined to help them fulfill what they've agreed to do. At the most basic level, FGCs are another practice in the restorative justice toolkit. And depending on the situation and context, one might find a victim offender conference or a circle process or FGC more appropriate. And in many places, aspects of each practice have been adopted and adapted and blended into hybrid practices. In fact, even FGCs themselves didn't emerge without some knowledge of what was happening elsewhere. For example, when Hollow Water began telling the story of their success using the Community Holistic Circle Healing Program at conferences and meetings across Canada, a judge from New Zealand, Judge Fred McElroy, was present to learn about that process, just as Yukon Judge Barry Stewart was present. And these kinds of international experiences of learning and sharing informed the development of a more restorative model back home in New Zealand. Similarly, the work in Elkhart, Indiana drew lessons both from the Elmira case and the circle work happening in Tlingit country as they created their practice of victim-offender mediation. And the mutual learning across continents has continued in the decades since. But FGCs are unique though, and their particularities matter. In addition to being a core restorative justice practice that facilitates dialogue, survivor agency, repair, and individual and relational healing, FGCs also work to reestablish the kinds of strong communal bonds and cultural practices that have been damaged by the colonial experience. For example, holding FGCs in a marae instead of a courtroom is one way that this happens. Inviting the broader community and centering the family as a decision-making actor in the process is another way that it happens. And so is opening with prayers or blessings, the inclusion of elders, and the ownership of the tribal community. If Nils Christie was worried that state ownership of the work of justice had stripped modern communities of their agency and ownership of their own conflicts, FGCs are one way Maori have reclaimed ownership over their own experiences with justice. And when we read FGCs not only as projects of individual repair, but of broader cultural and communal healing, we can see even more similarities between FGCs and Hollow Water. While attending to and empowering healing and accountability among individuals, both projects also represent the reclamation of traditional practices as a form of communal cultural healing that contributes to healing the wounds of colonization and not only the wounds of individual crime or harm doing. Where Hollow Water reintroduced sweat lodges and circles to the community, FGCs reintroduced the marae as a central gathering place for communal decision-making, and the vision of family that resists the one imposed by a Western vision of the nuclear family. Both are examples of a justice that heals not just individuals, but peoples. They are practices of communal healing as well as individual healing. Restorative justice restores not just individual survivors, but potentially communities. In other words, FGCs are part of a broader recent history and movement of indigenous peoples reclaiming traditional ways of knowing and doing to pursue a vision of justice as healing at the individual, relational, and communal levels. Around the world, indigenous peoples are resurrecting languages and religions that were once exterminated, rethinking governance in traditional and not only in Western ways, reclaiming ancient wisdoms of biology and medicine to promote their people's wellness, reinstituting traditional farming and foraging practices to sustain the physical and cultural health of their people, and more. Indigenous peacemaking and justice practices like circle processes and FGCs are one component of this global resurgence of indigenous ways of knowing and being. And FGCs and circles are also connected to the global movement for restorative justice among non-indigenous and diasporic peoples who've identified the failures of dominant justice systems and seek new ways forward that center accountability, repair, and healing more than retribution or punishment. For example, Morris Jenkins has demonstrated that traditional African-descended Gullah peoples have conflict resolution practices in the American South that share many values and practical elements that inform and make up the practices we've already explored. They seem to be cousins of some sort. And such communities continue to learn from and across these global experiments, adapt elements of them to their own context, and in doing so, pursue a vision of justice as healing. Thus far, we've explored this theme primarily in context of criminal harms in relatively stable societies. In our next lecture, we will explore the possibilities for this kind of justice in the aftermath of gross human rights violations, horrific violence, and moments of unstable social transitions.